Welcome to Echoes of the Midnight, where darkness whispers tales of the unknown and shadows hold secrets that chill the soul. Dive into haunting stories that linger long after the clock strikes 12. Here, every echo carries a spine-tingling mystery waiting to unfold. Now, dim the lights. Let the midnight whispers begin, and step into the shadows of our story.
Ava and David had always been the perfect couple. They met in college, drawn together by their shared love for art and adventure. David, with his calming presence and deep thoughts, balanced Ava's fiery ambition and drive. They'd spent 3 years building a life together. Late-night movie marathons, spontaneous weekend getaways, and long conversations about their dreams. They'd loved each other fiercely, but recently, something had shifted. Ava's job in marketing had always demanded her time, but lately it felt like it consumed her entire life. Every day was a new challenge, a new crisis to solve. She was promoted to head a high-profile project, which meant longer hours, more stress, and endless deadlines. The pressure took a toll, and slowly, the person David fell in love with started to slip away. Her smile became rarer, her laughter quieter. Nights meant working late into the morning, and weekends felt more like catch-up time than moments for them. It wasn't until Ava had a panic attack in the middle of a meeting, her hands shaking as she tried to hold it together, that David saw the breaking point. Her exhaustion, her sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, he couldn't stand watching her deteriorate. That evening, he held her tightly in their living room, his heart aching as she whispered, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." David suggested a break, a retreat to reset. "Let's run away, just the two of us. We need this." After a bit of research, they found a secluded wellness retreat in the European Alps. It promised total silence, yoga, meditation, and a chance to disconnect from the world. Ava hesitated, but felt a spark of hope. This could be what they needed, a chance to escape the chaos and reconnect with themselves and each other. As David held her hand, they shared a look of mutual understanding. "We can do this together," David whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Ava's face. Ava smiled softly, her heart lifting. It felt like the first time in weeks they were on the same page. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. They allowed, and the keys that held the reindeer true. It was nothing short of grueling. They flew for hours, then boarded a train that rattled through the countryside, and finally, a bus that twisted and turned along narrow mountain roads. Each leg of the trip seemed endless, each stretch of the journey feeling more surreal as the world outside turned into vast, untouched wilderness. Ava and David barely spoke during the trip. Every word seemed unnecessary, as though the world was pulling them into a deep, unspoken silence. The exhaustion was physical, but it was also emotional. A tiredness that seemed to come from something deeper than just the travel. When they finally arrived, it was like stepping into another world. The retreat was nestled in the Alps, a centuries-old stone lodge surrounded by towering pine trees, its windows offering sweeping views of snow-capped peaks and mist-covered valleys. The air was crisp, cold, and strangely pure. It felt like the mountains had swallowed them whole, leaving no trace of the outside world behind. At first, the serenity was overwhelming. There was no sound beyond the wind rustling through the trees and the crunch of snow underfoot. Everything felt distant and serene, as though they were the only people left on Earth. The stress and anxiety that had haunted Ava for months seemed to dissolve in the presence of the mountains. She found herself breathing more easily, her chest less tight with each passing moment. They were greeted by Master Einar, a man whose presence filled the space around him. He was an older figure with sharp, penetrating eyes that seemed to see through to their very souls. His smile was calm, inviting, almost magnetic. He wore simple robes, and his voice had a soothing, authoritative tone that made everything he said sound like profound wisdom. He welcomed them with open arms, explaining that the retreat was a sanctuary for the soul, a place where they could reconnect with their inner selves. "We seek healing here," Master Einar said, his gaze lingering on Ava and David. "But healing is not without sacrifice. Silence is the path to clarity. Your soul will be cleansed through meditation, yoga, and reflection." Ava and David exchanged a quiet glance. They'd read about the retreat's rules, a strict vow of silence for the duration of their stay, but hearing it from Master Einar's lips felt almost like an invocation. They were given notebooks upon arrival to communicate with each other if necessary, but were told that speech was a disruption to the cleansing process. Silence, it seemed, was the first step in their spiritual journey. The first few days were disorienting, but Ava felt a strange peace. She awoke at dawn for the daily meditation ritual. The practice was intense. Long hours spent in stillness, focusing only on the breath, each exhale pushing away the worries of the outside world. Afterward, they practiced yoga, slow and deliberate movements that stretched every part of the body. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of discipline that Ava hadn't realized she craved. Even the silence seemed natural, like a protective veil that shielded them from the noise of their past lives. David, too, seemed to find a kind of peace. The tension that had hung over their relationship seemed to dissipate in the quiet, as though the stillness was giving them space to breathe, to think, to simply be together without the weight of the world pressing down on them. But as the days went by, an unease began to creep in. It wasn't immediate. It was subtle at first. They would catch glances from the other guests during meals, eyes that seemed empty, distant. Some of them would nod eagerly at Master Einar's words like they were hanging on every syllable, while others remained unnervingly still, their faces frozen in an expression of devotion that felt almost too intense. Ava couldn't help but notice how rigid everyone was, how the guests moved in synchronized ways, together, yet apart. Their movements were too precise, too controlled, as though they were all following some unseen rhythm, some shared goal that Ava and David weren't a part of. At night, when the lodge settled into complete silence, Ava felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the stillness that surrounded them. The walls of the lodge seemed to close in, and the shadows cast by the dim lanterns grew long and strange. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. One evening, after a particularly intense yoga session, Ava felt herself retreating into her thoughts. She looked over at David, hoping to exchange a glance, but he was sitting stiffly, eyes unfocused. The momentary connection they'd once shared seemed to be slipping away, and for the first time since they arrived, she felt a deep isolation, like the world had shrunk to just the two of them, standing on the edge of something they didn't understand. The rituals themselves were supposed to cleanse their souls, but Ava began to question whether they were truly healing. There was something off about the way Master Einar spoke, about the way the other guests behaved. Their devotion seemed too unquestioning, their obedience too perfect. The routines, the meditation, the yoga were intense, almost relentless. She wondered if the silence was meant to open them up to something, or if it was a tool to shut them off from the world entirely. At times, she could almost hear the sound of her own heartbeat, echoing in her ears, asking her why she felt so trapped. But when she looked around, all she could see were people in the same trance-like state, eyes downcast, lost in their own thoughts. It was as though the retreat wasn't just a place for healing, but a place where something darker lurked, waiting for them to unravel. David, too, began to sense it. Their connection, once so strong, now felt fragile. The silence between them was no longer comforting. It felt like a barrier, an unspoken distance growing between them, and in the quiet, the cracks in their relationship that had seemed so distant began to widen. Ava knew they had to escape, but the question lingered in her mind. Escape from what? And would they be able to leave before it was too late? Ava couldn't shake the restlessness that had settled over her. The retreat, once a haven of peace, now felt suffocating. The silence that had initially soothed her soul now pressed down on her like a heavy weight. Even David, who had seemed at ease, was growing quieter, his once warm eyes clouded with something she couldn't quite place. It was as though the retreat was pulling them apart instead of bringing them closer. One evening, unable to sleep, Ava slipped out of their room. The lodge was eerily quiet, the air thick with stillness. She padded down the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps muffled by the old wooden floors. As she turned a corner, she saw a small group of guests moving silently toward a concealed doorway near the back of the lodge. Her heart raced. Something about their movement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Compelled by curiosity, Ava followed, keeping a safe distance. The doorway led to a narrow staircase that spiraled downward, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, they entered a room unlike any other in the lodge. It was vast and dimly lit, the walls covered in ancient symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering candlelight. Murals depicted grotesque scenes of rituals, sacrifices, and figures bowing before a shadowy entity. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface etched with strange markings, their grooves filled with a substance that glistened darkly in the candlelight. Ava's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary wellness retreat. The serenity of the lodge above was a mask, hiding something dark and ancient. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt frozen. She watched as the group of guests began to chant in unison, their voices low and guttural, the sound reverberating through the room like a pulse. Before she could witness more, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She spun around, her heart pounding, to find one of the retreat staff members glaring at her. The man said nothing, simply motioned for her to leave. Trembling, she obeyed, her mind racing with questions. Back in her room, she recounted everything to David, her voice barely whispered. His face grew pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The next morning, Ava and David tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the weight of what she'd seen lingered. Their paranoia grew with each passing hour. The smiles of the staff seemed forced, their eyes watchful. The other guests seemed even more distant, their movements almost robotic, their faces unnervingly serene. It was as if everyone knew something they didn't. Later that day, a timid young woman named Elise, one of the newer guests, approached them during a brief moment when the staff wasn't watching. She handed Ava a hastily folded note, her hands trembling. "Meet me in the garden tonight," the note read. "You need to know the truth." Under the cover of darkness, they met Elise in the garden, hidden behind tall hedges. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously as she spoke in hushed tones. "This isn't a retreat," she whispered. "It's a cult. Master Einar isn't just some spiritual leader. He's the head of it. They believe in an ancient ritual that grants immortality, but it requires a sacrifice." Ava felt her stomach drop. David clutched her hand, his grip tightening as Elise continued. They choose one person, a guest, someone vulnerable, someone pure. They prepare us with the routines, the meditation, the cleansing diets. It's all to get us ready for the ritual. They watch us, study us. They've already started the process. How do you know all this? David asked, his voice barely audible. Elise hesitated, then pulled back her sleeve to reveal faint scars on her arm. I escaped. Another retreat they ran. I thought I could expose them, but they found me. I had no choice but to return. Ava's mind raced. The signs were everywhere now. The vacant stares, the obsessive devotion, the strange energy that seemed to pervade the lodge. They were part of this, unwitting players in a horrific ritual. Worse still, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she and David were the prime targets. Their emotional vulnerability, their struggles, it all made them the perfect candidates. We have to leave, Ava said, her voice shaking. Elise's expression darkened. It's not that simple. The lodge is locked at night, and during the day, the staff watches everyone. They'll know if you try to leave. They always know. Ava and David returned to their room, their minds racing. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. The serenity of the retreat had been replaced by an overwhelming dread. Ava sat by the window, staring out at the dark forest, wondering if they would ever escape. David paced the room, his fists clenched. We'll find the way, he said firmly, but the doubt in his voice betrayed his words. Ava and David's search for the truth began with whispered encounters in the shadows. Other guests, disillusioned and frightened, shared their suspicions. Every secret exchange, every passing moment of silence peeled away the layers of illusion that had once made the retreat seem like a sanctuary. The more they learned, the more they realized how deeply entangled they were in something far darker than they could have imagined. They discovered that Master Einar was not just a guru, he was an immortal being, an ancient figure who had managed to cheat death for centuries through the ritual he conducted. The cult's origins reached back to the medieval period, when Einar, then a young monk, had discovered forbidden occult arts. Driven by a thirst for power and a desperate desire to escape death, he had sacrificed his own brothers, his closest kin, in a blood-soaked ceremony to gain immortality. The sacrifice had worked. His brother's blood had sealed his fate, ensuring that Einar would never age, never die. Since that fateful night, Einar had continued his dark work, moving from monastery to monastery, gathering followers and establishing retreats that were nothing more than fronts for his twisted agenda. Over the centuries, the cult had evolved, but the essence remained the same: find a pure, willing soul, sacrifice them, and give Einar the eternal life he sought. But it wasn't just Master Einar who had cheated death. The disciples who had been with him for decades, those whose faces seemed unnervingly ageless, were not just his followers. They were also part of the ritual. They had given up their own souls, serving as living vessels for Einar's power. As long as the rituals continued, they too maintained their youthful appearances, their bodies free from the ravages of time. It was a cycle that perpetuated itself, each generation feeding the next. The ritual that Master Einar and his disciples performed to achieve immortality was rooted in ancient occult practices that had been passed down through centuries. At the heart of the ritual was a sacrifice, a life given willingly in exchange for eternal power. However, this was not just any ordinary human sacrifice. It was a highly specific and meticulously performed ceremony designed to harness the purest energy from the chosen victim, elevating the cult leader to an immortal state. Before the ritual could take place, the chosen participant had to be carefully prepared. This preparation involved weeks, sometimes even months, of purification and cleansing. During this period, the participant would undergo a strict regimen of meditation, yoga, and dietary restrictions, meant to purify the body and mind. The goal was to strip away any negative emotions, impurities, or distractions, leaving the person as physically and emotionally pure as possible. The ritual always took place in a hidden chamber deep within the retreat's complex. This room was shrouded in secrecy, accessible only to the highest-ranking cult members. Inside, the walls were adorned with ancient symbols, runes, and sigils that had been inscribed over centuries. These symbols acted as channels to the dark forces that the cult sought to invoke. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, an ancient piece of architecture that had witnessed countless sacrifices over the years. The altar was meticulously maintained, its surface marked with deep grooves and symbols, etched into the stone by blood and dark incantations over the centuries. The room was always dimly lit, with candles burning low in strategic locations. The flickering flame cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls, heightening the sense of fear and anticipation. The air felt thick with an otherworldly energy, charged with dark power. Before the actual sacrifice, the cult members would gather in a circle around the altar. Chanting would begin, slow and rhythmic, in a language long forgotten by modern society. The chants were meant to draw energy from the surrounding environment, from the earth itself. This energy would be absorbed by the altar and the participants, heightening their spiritual awareness. As the chanting continued, the room would become charged, vibrating with an unnatural force. The chosen one, stripped of all clothing, would be positioned on the altar. The cult members would then perform a final purification ritual, a cleansing of the body and soul. This was typically done through the application of sacred oils and herbs rubbed into the skin to purify the flesh. These oils were said to make the body more receptive to the spiritual transformation that would soon take place. The sacrifice would be bound to the altar, either physically or symbolically. In some cases, this binding was done using ropes, while in others, it was a mental connection, an agreement of sorts made between the sacrifice and the cult leader. The leader would speak words of promise to the victim, offering them eternal peace and release from their earthly struggles if they surrendered themselves willingly to the ritual. However, the true purpose was always to sever their connection with the physical world and offer them as a vessel for dark power. The heart of the ritual involved the physical sacrifice. This was the most delicate and dangerous part of the ceremony, as the cult had to ensure that the sacrifice was done in such a way that it maximized the transfer of life energy. Master Einar, or another high-ranking member of the cult, would approach the altar with a ritualistic dagger, its blade inscribed with runes. The dagger was plunged into the chest of the victim, aiming for the heart. As the victim's life force began to ebb away, the cult members would chant louder, their voices rising in intensity. The victim's blood would spill onto the altar, soaking into the stone grooves and triggering the final stages of the ritual. It was said that at the moment of death, the soul of the sacrifice was released and captured by the ritual, its energy channeled directly into Master Einar. The blood of the sacrifice was absorbed by the altar, and the energy would flow directly into the cult leader's body. Once the sacrifice was complete, the ritual would enter its final phase. The cult believed that, in this moment, the essence of the sacrifice, their soul, would be absorbed into the very fabric of the leader's being. The energy of the sacrifice would rejuvenate the cult leader, granting them eternal life and enhanced powers. The disciples would then gather around the altar, each one taking a small portion of the sacrifice's blood, believing that it would grant them longevity and the ability to continue serving their immortal leader. After the ritual was complete, the sacrifice's body would be disposed of, often through burial or some other ceremonial method, to avoid leaving any trace of the victim. The cult members would then return to their daily lives, their faces ageless, their spirits invigorated, awaiting the next chosen one. For Master Einar, the cycle never ended. He had lived for centuries, each ritual keeping him alive and powerful. The more Ava and David learned, the more they realized how deeply they were entwined in the ritual. They were prime candidates. Their vulnerability, their emotional wounds, their personal struggles, they were the perfect offerings. The cult members watched them with careful eyes, observing their every move. Ava's anxiety, David's protective instincts, their strained relationship, all of it made them ideal choices for the sacrifice. The cult believed that the purest souls, those most in need of healing, would give the most power to the ritual, and with their arrival, Master Einar had already begun to plan. Ava's nights became filled with disturbing dreams. She would wake in the dead of night, gasping for air, her heart racing. The dreams were vivid, haunting, visions of shadowy figures that whispered to her in low, guttural tones. They called to her, beckoning her into their fold, urging her to accept her place in the ritual, to join them and become something greater than human. The lines between waking and sleeping blurred. She couldn't escape the visions. They followed her in the silence of the retreat, in the stillness of the lodge, creeping into her thoughts during the day. In one particularly chilling dream, she saw herself lying on an altar, surrounded by robed figures. Blood soaked the ground beneath her, and Master Einar stood over her, his face not the kind, wise man she had come to know, but something much darker. His eyes black as night, filled with an insatiable hunger. The figures chanted, and the air crackled with energy as the ritual unfolded, their voices rising in unison. Ava's body felt weightless, her soul torn between terror and an unnatural pull toward the dark power that surrounded her. David, increasingly protective of her, tried to confront Master Einar. One evening, after a particularly disturbing dream, he stormed into Einar's private chambers, demanding answers. The serene leader, ever calm, listened as David poured out his fears. Einar responded with soothing words, as if the weight of David's concerns were mere distractions. This is the healing process, my son, Einar said, his voice like velvet, lulling David into a sense of confusion. You will see in time, all will be well, trust the process. But David felt the weight of the lie in Einar's words. Something was off. Everything felt orchestrated, planned down to the smallest detail. The retreat was not about healing. It was a carefully crafted illusion designed to break their spirits, to manipulate them into believing that they were part of something greater, something pure. They weren't here to heal. They were here to be consumed. Ava's desperation grew. The nights were the worst. Her dreams continued to torment her, and she could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. One night, she woke up in a cold sweat, hearing soft footsteps outside their door. She opened her eyes, heart pounding, to see shadows move outside the window. It was as if the retreat was closing in on her, trapping her in its web. Together, Ava and David began to piece together the rituals. The blood, the sacrifice, the chosen one. They knew they had to leave before it was too late, but with every attempt to break free, they were drawn deeper into the cult's clutches. Each time they tried to confront the truth, they were met with subtle manipulations, whispers of doubt, gentle hands guiding them back into the fold. They were running out of time. As the days grew shorter, Ava and David felt the suffocating pressure of time. The retreat's once serene atmosphere now felt like a noose tightening around them, each breath heavier than the last. The cult had them on edge, watching, waiting for the right moment to complete their ancient, twisted ritual. Their only hope was the sliver of a chance they had uncovered, a way to escape. The final ritual day arrived, and the weight of the looming ceremony pressed down on them. Ava could feel the tension thick in the air, as if every breath carried the weight of their impending doom. Master Einar's calm demeanor had only made it worse. He was always one step ahead, his words like velvet, lulling everyone into submission. But Ava and David, now armed with knowledge of the retreat's hidden ways, refused to go down without a fight. In the dead of night, while the others were being gathered for the ceremony, Ava and David slipped into the secret passages. They had found an unmarked door at the end of a narrow, disused hallway, a door hidden behind an ornate tapestry. Behind it was a stairway that descended deep into the earth, winding and cold. They moved quickly, silently, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. The passages were a maze, twisting and turning through the bowels of the lodge. They had no map to guide them, but they relied on their instincts and the journal's fragmented clues. Ava's heart raced with every step, but she could feel the weight of their actions lifting with each passing moment. They were one step closer to freedom. As they neared the ritual chamber, they realized the time had come to disable the wards. The journal had mentioned symbols etched into the walls, protective runes designed to keep intruders at bay. Ava's hand trembled as she traced the shapes, whispering the forgotten words of an incantation she barely understood. The rooms flickered, then dimmed, and with a surge of relief, the protective barrier fell. But as they were about to enter the chamber, something shifted. The air grew thick with a malevolent presence. The ground beneath their feet trembled, as if the very foundation of the lodge was alive. A low, guttural chant began from within the ritual chamber, growing louder and more insistent, resonating in their bones. The cult had begun. In that moment of chaos, Ava and David made their move. They rushed into the chamber, determined to stop the ritual. Master Einar, standing over the altar with his disciples, turned as they burst through the door, his face twisted in fury and disbelief. The ritual, however, was already spiraling out of control. The moment they disrupted the ceremony, something dark and ancient was unleashed. The lodge shook violently, as if the earth itself was rejecting the dark energy that had been summoned. A blinding light filled the room, and Einar, once so composed, began to scream in agony. The immortality he had sought for centuries had backfired. His body, frozen in time for so long, began to age rapidly. His skin shriveled, his bones cracked, and his once vibrant eyes clouded over, consumed by the very ritual he had used to cheat death. The cult members, stunned and terrified, scattered in all directions, but Ava and David did not stop. They raced through the crumbling lodge, the air thick with the remnants of dark magic and supernatural energy. The walls groaned, as if the building itself was fighting to keep them in. The very ground beneath them trembled, the trees outside swaying violently as if the forest was alive, closing in on them. Ava and David ran, fear fueling their every step, until they burst out into the cold, dark night. The woods stretched out before them, an endless expanse of trees and shadows. They didn't stop running until they could no longer hear the screams behind them, until the retreat, now a place of nightmares, was nothing but a dark shape in the distance. Exhausted and gasping for breath, they collapsed in the snow, the weight of their escape settling in. The mountains loomed around them, vast and unforgiving, but they were free. For the first time in days, Ava could breathe again, her heart no longer pounding with fear. They had escaped the grip of the cult, but the terror of what they had endured would haunt them forever. Ava, driven by fear and desperation, had begun to look deeper into the strange and unsettling inconsistencies she had noticed in the lodge. Late one night, while exploring the hidden corners of the retreat, she found a dusty, forgotten journal tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the hallway outside their room. The journal, belonging to a former guest, chronicled a story of one who had nearly escaped the cult's clutches. The guests had written about a secret network of hidden passages within the lodge, forgotten hallways, concealed doors, and ancient symbols carved into the walls. These passages were meant to protect the cult's rituals, but also, Ava realized, could offer a way out. The guest had written of a narrow escape route leading through the dense woods and away from the retreat's grasp, but the curse had nearly claimed them. It was clear now, Ava and David were not alone in their fight for freedom, but they had to act quickly. As the days ticked down to the ritual, they began to study the passages described in the journal, cautiously mapping them out as best they could. The cult, ever vigilant, was always a step ahead, their watchful eyes making any move feel like an immense risk. Ava and David's escape from the retreat did not bring the peace they had hoped for. Though physically free, their minds were trapped in a prison of haunting memories. The once tranquil life they had imagined for themselves back in the US felt like a distant dream, something they could no longer touch. Each day felt like walking through fog, the weight of the past pressing down on them. For Ava, the journey to healing was slow and arduous. The nightmares didn't stop. They came in waves, vivid and suffocating, reminding her of the darkness they had escaped. In one dream, she found herself back in the lodge, the walls closing in, and Master Einar's cold, unblinking eyes watching her. Even when awake, she could feel his presence, like a shadow looming over her every move. She tried to push it away, to find some semblance of normality, but the feeling of being watched never left. David, however, struggled more profoundly. While Ava fought to piece herself back together, he was consumed by guilt. The faces of the people they couldn't save haunted him. He couldn't forgive himself for not doing more, for not realizing sooner the true nature of the retreat. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blood-soaked altar, heard the chants reverberating in his ears. His thoughts raced, spiraling into darkness. He began to doubt his own perception of reality. Was he still running from the cult? Or had it followed them? They vowed never to speak of the retreat again, hoping silence would offer some relief. But the silence was deafening. Their connection to the world had been severed in ways neither could comprehend, leaving them disconnected from everything they once knew. The cult and the dark forces tied to it were always just a whisper away, lingering in the corners of their lives, watching, waiting. Though they tried to move forward, they both knew deep down that the past would never let them go. Master Einar's influence, dark and unyielding, would forever cast its shadow over their lives.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more. See you next time.